Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are studying the book of Esther, chapter 8. That is Megillat Esther Parak Ches. And for those that have been keeping up, would remember that at the end of chapter 7, we learned of the demise of Haman. Haman, who had been responsible for the genocidal decree against the Jewish people. Haman, who had been uplifted by the king and made the second in command. However, Haman's arrogance got the better of him. The king eventually, through the intervention of Queen Esther, learned that Haman was truly the disloyal one, while Mordechai was his loyal assistant, and Mordechai should therefore be raised up uh, in the ranks of the royal system, and Haman should be hung on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordechai. So at this point, there is still a major problem, and that is that Haman's decree is still out there. The decree that Haman was responsible for was signed by the king and sent to all of the provinces of the land, and declared that on the 13th day of the month of Adar, that um, the people of the kingdom should rise up and slaughter all of the Jewish people, men, women, children combined, and take all of their property. Shalom, the take all of their property for themselves. And this decree was still out there. So Mordechai now has some work to do. Mordechai and Esther, of course, have some serious work to do to save the people. Haman is gone, their main nemesis is gone, but now they have to work harder. Now, remember, just the way we've been understanding all of these chapters was that it was a contest really between what type of loyalty, and I put loyalty in quotes, does the king really desire? Does he want the type of loyalty that came from a person like Haman, who was flattering of the king, paying off the king with bribes, but his intention was to really usurp the king and eventually overtake him? Would the king fall for that kind of loyalty, or will the king admire and advance the loyalty, the honest loyalty of Mordecai, the loyalty of someone who was willing to sacrifice himself to the king? And the Jewish people were presented by Haman falsely as people who were disloyal to the king, while Esther presented her people to the king as those who would be willing to sacrifice anything for him. And because of the behaviors of Mordecai and Haman, the king realized that Esther and Mordecai were right, and the Jewish people therefore were deserved to be saved and supported. So with that background, let's look at chapter 8. Bayomahu, on that day, meaning the day that the Haman was hung in the gallows, was executed. Nasan Hamelach Achashverosh la Esther Hamalka, the king Achashverosh gave to Esther the queen at Beit Haman Sorer HaYehudim. He gave him the home or the palace of Haman, who was uh, the enemy. The Tzorer is the one who made the Jews suffer, the enemy of the Jewish people. Mordechai and Mordechai Balifnei Hamelach came before the king. Higida Esther Mahula, because Esther had now, remember, Esther had been hiding who her family was and where she was from, but now Esther had, presumably because Mordecai allowed her to do so because the situation changed, Esther had told him what his relationship to her was. So now the king, who knows Mordecai already, who knows him as a loyal supporter, the king now finds out that Mordecai is the cousin and the foster father of Queen Esther. So Mordecai is now coming before the king. He is now raised higher in the king's court. Vayasar Hamelach et tabato, and the king took off his signet ring, asher ha'avir me Haman, the same one which he had removed from Haman prior to Haman's execution. Vayitna Mordechai, and he gave it to Mordechai. Vatasem Esther as Mordechai al beis Haman, and Esther, now because the king had given Esther the rights over the house, the palace of Haman, Esther placed Mordechai in charge of the house of Haman. Vatosef Esther, and then Esther continued and spoke and spoke before the king, because now they had just executing Haman and having the rights over Haman's property. is not going to save the Jewish people. So she spoke before the king, Vatipol lifnei raglav, and she fell before his legs. This is just demonstrating how she humbled herself before the king, even in this position, even though now she's independently wealthy and she has the house of Haman, which was presumably a special castle of some sort. Vatef got his son-in-law, and she cried and she supplicated before the king, L'havir et ra'at Haman ha'agagi, to remove um, uh, and to repeal the evil decree which Haman the Agagite had had made. Et machshavto, and his plans, asher chashav al Yehudim, that he had planned to do to the Jewish people. Vayoshet hamelach leEsther et shavit hazahav, and the king uh, uh, extended his golden scepter towards Esther. Vatakam Esther, and Esther then stood up because she was prostrated before the king. But once he put out the scepter and touched her with it, she was allowed to stand. Vata'amod lifnei hamelach, and then she then stood up before the king. Vatomer, and she said, Im al hamelach tov, if this is okay with the king, always with this very, very humble language. And if I have found favor in the king's eyes. The triplicate. And this thing seems right to the king. She's leaving all of the judgment in the eyes of the king. Remember, when Haman spoke with the king, he did not speak with nearly this kind of deference. V'tova ani be'einav, and then a fourth phrase, and I am good in his eyes. In other words, the king realizes that my path of humility, and my path of loyalty is good for the king, and the king likes me and likes the path that I've chosen. So then he kasev, let the king write l'hashivet tasvarim, to repeal and to take back those scrolls, those decrees that were the machshevet Haman ben Hamdasa Hagagi, that were the product of the devious thoughts of Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, Asher Kotav, that he had written Abedet Hayudim, to destroy the Jews, Asher B'chol Medinot HaMelech, that are located throughout all of the provinces of the king. Ki echocha uchal v'roisi, because how could I possibly go on, and while I see b'ra'ah asher yimsoeh sami, this evil fate that is going to befall my nation, ve'echacha uchal v'roisi, and how could I be able to withstand and still be able to see bi'ovdan moladati, when I see the destruction of the people in which I was born? Vayomer Hamelach Achashverosh. So the king, so this plea is just a plea of crying, a plea of humility, a plea of definitely loyalty to the king, but a plea, please repeal these decrees. However, unfortunately, the king could not do that, and we'll see why in a minute. Vayomer Hamelach Achashverosh, and the king Achashverosh said, LeEsther Hamalka, to Esther the queen, Ula Mordechai HaYehudi, and to Mordechai the Jew. Hine beis Haman nasati leEsther. Behold, this is the house of Haman that I have given to Esther. We also tolu alaites, and we hung Haman on the gallows asher shalach yado by Yehudim, that he is the one who sent his hand out against the Jews. In other words, he had plotted to hurt them. So that much I've done. The, and it's, in other words, what he's saying is that I've given you power and prestige. The king cannot, and we'll see why in a minute, why that he cannot repeal the decree. But he's trying to point out something to Esther and Mordechai, give them the ability to do something to countermand that decree. So the first thing he does is he establishes, I have given you the house of Haman, meaning I have given you I have removed your enemy, your your primary arch enemy, and I have given you the trappings of power. I have given you a palace. I've given you a special house which people look at as the house of the second to the king. In other words, I've uplifted you so that when people look at you, they see that you are the one who has the king's favor. You are the one that has the power and might of the Persian Empire behind you. So now I'm going to tell you what to do to save your people. V'atem, and now you, kitzvu al hayudim, you write regarding the Jews, katov be'enechem, however you want to write, b'shem hamelech, in the name of the king. This is your plan. You decide to write which decree needs to be written in order to save the Jews from this decree. V'chismu b'tabat hamelech, and you can seal it with the seal of the king. And why is it that I don't just simply repeal it? Because once something is written in the name of the king, and it is sealed with the signet ring of the king, we cannot take it back. Once in the Persian rules are, once it's signed and sealed by the king, it can never be taken back. There's no such thing as a decree that can be repealed. They didn't have a system of repeal back then, at least in Persia. So therefore, what I'm telling you is, I'm giving you honor. I'm showing the people how high you up are in my kingdom. I'm giving you the power to write whatever you want. And whatever you write, you can figure out a way now to use that to to save the people. And remember, this whole issue, the whole fight here, the whole disagreement was a issue between Haman and Mordechai, whether the path of who is going to show, who is going to be the one who gets the favor of the king. Is it the one that acts like Mordechai, the one that acts like the Queen Esther, who is loyal, who is faithful, who is honest, or is it going to be the arrogant and selfish one and the one who lies and is full of hate like Haman? So Mordechai and Esther can now show the people of Persia that it is they who have been determined to be the ones who have the favor of the king. So therefore, Vayikaru Sofrei HaMelech Ba'isahi, they called up the scribes of the king at that time, B'chodesh HaShlishi, which was the third month, B'chodesh Sivan, the month of Sivan, B'shlosha V'yasrim Bo, on the 23rd day of Sivan. So this is, several months before the day of the 13th. So there's time for this decree to be disseminated and absorbed by the people. Vayikasev K'chol Asher Tziva Mordechai El HaYehudim, and it was written, everything that Mordechai commanded should be written regarding the Jewish people. The El Ha'achashtar Penim, the Hapachot, the Sorei Hamdinot, and these decrees were sent out to all of the and I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And it was written, everything that Mordechai commanded, El HaYehudim, directed to the Jews. In other words, and this is interesting because last time they sent out a decree, they sent it to every Medina or Medina, every province according to its language and its alphabet. But it wasn't sent to the Jews because they didn't have a Medina. They didn't have a place that was there, so there was nothing sent. But this decree was written to the Medina, to the provinces, but also to the Jews and to all of the leaders, the satraps and the governors, the Sareha Medinos, and those who were in charge of the various provinces, Asher Mehodu Yad Kush, that were spread across the kingdom from India all the way to Ethiopia. Sheva V'Yasser Mumea Medina, all 127 provinces. Medina Kichsava, every province according to its writing, its alphabet, and every nation according to its language, the El HaYehudim, and to the Jewish people also Kichsavam according to their writing, presumably in their language of Hebrew, and according to their language. So this one was different. This itself, considering the Jewish people to be a nation worthy of getting the message in their own language and so on, is a recognition of the importance of the Jewish people in the kingdom, just like those Medinos, uh, which is a very important idea and reflects a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Um, because if you remember, Haman tried to say they don't even have a Medina; they're worthless to you. They don't bring you any land. They don't bring you any property. They don't bring you any wealth. So they don't have their own nation. So so Haman kind of set them apart in that way. But Mordechai is including them. Mordechai is demonstrating that they are important to the king. Vayichtov b'shem hamelach, and his decree. We didn't yet read what he wrote. We're about to read that, and it was written in the name of the king Achashverosh. Vayachtom b'tabat hamelach, and it was signed with the signet ring of the king. Vayishlach svarim, and the decrees were sent via haratzim, through the runners, basusim, by horses, rochvei areches and those that were riding the big horses that are used in the service of the king Bnei Haramachim, that want the horses that were bred by the king to be fast and strong horses. And what was it that was written? Asher Nasan HaMelech LaYehudim, that the king has now given to the Jewish people, Asher B'chol Ir V'ir, that are in every city, Lihikahel, to gather V'la'amod al Nafsham, and defend their lives. The idea here being that by declaring in the name of the king and with the power of the king's palace behind them, that the Jews can defend themselves, they show that the tide has turned in a different direction, and that there was a decree to kill the Jews, but the Jews now have the support of the kingdom behind them, and that they can stand up and defend themselves. This is key. This is a key word that some people miss when they read this verse. They had permission to defend themselves, lihashmid v'laharog l'abed, to destroy and to kill and to exterminate whom et kolchel am umedina, the armies of any nation or province, hatzarim otam, that was making them suffer. In other words, they had permission to defend themselves only against those people who come to attack them. So even though the language of Hashmid Harog al Abeid is pretty strong language, that they were given permission to kill, it wasn't an indiscriminate genocidal killing. It was to destroy et kol chel, the armies specifically, of the nations that attack them. And then it says, Taf v'noshim, and also of those that attack them, the women and children, ushalalam lavos. And they can also plunder from those people who attack them, they can plunder the property after they defend themselves. Now, there are problematic parts of this verse. One, that giving a command to the Jewish people to kill women and children and shlolam lavos, and to despoil, and to plunder the property of the people that they kill, seems barbaric. However, let's bear this in mind. One thing, first of all, we'll understand this a lot better in the next chapter when we see what actually happened. So that's number one. So I'm going to leave you in a little bit of suspense, but I'm going to leave you a little bit bothered. You can be bothered, morally bothered by this decree. I'm only going to state one other thing regarding this, though, and that is that number one, it was clearly stated against El Kol Chel, against the armies, and it was also not indiscriminate. It was only against those that are Tsarim Otam, only against those that come to attack them. So it was clearly a decree of self defense. But the strength of this decree was clearly meant to show that the Jews now had the same support that from the king that Haman had before these events happened, that Haman had last time. The purpose was to sow fear among the enemy, to show that they had a lot to lose by attacking. This because remember, there still is a decree on the books to kill the Jews, also signed by the king. So the only way that Mordechai and Esther had was to show their strength, show their royalty, show how they've been raised in the royal house, and to sow fear in the public in order to defend the Jews. But remember, that's only part of the answer as to why this decree sounds so harsh and was written with such strong language. The rest of the answer we'll find out in the next chapter when we read what happened. Biyom echad, and when will they do this? On one particular day, b'chol medinot hamelech Achashverosh, in all of the provinces of the king Achashverosh, the Jews will have one day to do what we just described, to defend themselves and kill those that come to attack them. And what day is that? B'shlosha asar l'chodesh, on the 13th day of the month, Shnei Masaru Chodesh Adar. So he's clearly stating the Jews don't have the right to go and plunder and kill just random. But that specific day on which their lives are in danger because of the decree, on that specific day, we're giving them permission to stand up for themselves and defend themselves. Patshegen Aksav, the text of the document, the Hinat and Das, was placed in the annals of law, B'chol Medina Medina, in each and every province. Goloy l'chol ha'amim, it was open to be read by all of the nations, to be publicized. V'liot hayudim atidim le'yom hazeh, and so that the Jewish people should be prepared for this day. This is a mirror of the same language that the original document against the Jews was, that we're sending this out to be a public document so that everyone should be prepared to kill the Jews on this day. And now we're using the same language in the opposite, saying so that the Jews should be prepared to defend themselves, lihina keme ovehem, to avenge themselves against their enemies. So this is specifically directed against their enemies. Haratzim, the runners, rochvei areches and the ones who are riding the big, strong royal horses, yatzum and vohalim, they left in a rush, duchufim, and in with urgency, b'dvar melech, by the command of the king, v'adot nisna b'Shushan bira, and the rule and the law was laid down in the capital Shushan. So here, verse 15, Mordechai now Yatzam milfnei Hamelech, left from before the king, Biluvish Malchus, dressed in royal robes, Tchelet Vachor, in blue wool and white, va'ateret zahav gedola, and a large golden crown, v'tachrich butz v'argamon, and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool, v'ya'ir Shushan, so alav v'samecha, in the city of Shushan. Presumably the Jews of the city of Shushan were happy and joyous. Verse 16, La Yehudim, and for the Jews, Haisa Ora, there was light, v'simcha, and there was happiness, v'sason, and there was joy, bikar, and there was honor. This word honor is important. Why is Mordechai all of a sudden taking on this mantle and wearing the royal clothes when Mordechai was the humble one who wasn't interested in the royal clothes? Again, this is what is necessary in order to save the Jewish people. He had to show that it was he and it was the one who was loyal to the king, and it was the Jews who are the truly loyal ones to the king and that have the power and the might of the Persian Empire behind them. Otherwise, if it he doesn't otherwise the attack against the Jews will still take place on the 13th day of Adar. He has to make show that the people will not that the masses will not rise against the Jews, but turn the tide so that many more of those masses will either join the Jews or defend the Jews in their defense. V'chol medina umedina, and this is what and the next verse, after talking about Mordechai dressing like that, says that he accomplished exactly that. So what I'm saying is not just my understanding of what Mordechai is doing, which is reasonable enough, but the verse itself says so, because the next verse says, "V'chol medina umedina," in every one of the provinces of V'chol ir v'ir, and in every city, Mekom asher dvar hamelech v'daso magia, wherever the words of the king and his laws reached. Simcha v'sason la'Yehudim, there was happiness and joy for the Jewish people. Mishta v'yom tov, there were parties and holidays. V'rabim, and many of the people me'amei haaretz, from the other nations of the land, mityahadim, there's several ways you can translate this, but mityahadim, became Jews. In other words, they either meaning that they allied themselves with the Jews, or that means that they actually converted to Judaism because they saw that Judaism was on the ascendancy. Kinofal pachad haYehudim aleim, because the fear of the Jews fell upon them when they realized that the might of the Persian Empire was behind them. So now we are set up for a situation which we're going to study in the next chapter, is what happened on the 13th day of Adar, when the Jew haters had a decree and permission to kill them, and the Jews had a decree and permission to defend themselves, but the wave of popular support was now leaning in the Jewish direction. Thank you so much for studying chapter 8 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 9 and the rest of the book of Esther together.